August 1945. Japan has surrendered. The war is over. But in the jungles, the mountains, and the islands of the Pacific, it didn't end. It simply went quiet. And then it kept going. Justice was declared. Peace was signed. Yet some soldiers never laid down their weapons. Not for years. Not for decades. So here is the question that still unsettles historians. When a war officially ends, but men keep fighting, who is responsible for what follows? The story most people remember is simple. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Surrender aboard the USS Missouri. A defeated empire. A world moving on. Textbooks end here. So do commemorations. The assumption is finality, that orders were obeyed, that armies went home, that the killings stopped. But this version of history depends on distance, on maps, on ceremonies far from the ground. Because far from Tokyo Bay, the war fractured, and in those fractures, it refused to die. Imperial Japanese doctrine was absolute. Surrender was dishonor. Capture was shame worse than death. Soldiers were trained to fight until annihilation, or until a direct order came from a superior officer relieving them of duty. No order meant no end. When Japan collapsed in August 1945, communication lines were destroyed. Command structures dissolved. Units vanished into terrain designed to erase them. In that silence, some soldiers concluded only one thing. The war could not be over, because no one had told them it was. In 1944, 2nd Lieutenant Onoda was deployed to Lubang Island in the Philippines. His orders were explicit. Conduct guerrilla warfare, destroy enemy resources, never surrender, never take your own life. When American forces landed, Onoda retreated into the jungle with 3 other soldiers. Then Japan surrendered. Leaflets were dropped from the air. Newspapers appeared. Loudspeakers announced the war's end. Onoda dismissed them all as enemy deception. One by one, his companions died. Some in firefights, one by surrender. Onoda remained. For 29 years, he stole food from villages, fired on farmers, killed civilians he believed were enemy collaborators. He was not hiding. He was fighting a war frozen in 1945. He did not stop until 1974, when his former commanding officer, now a civilian, flew to the island and formally relieved him of duty. Onoda surrendered in full uniform. His rifle still worked. His ammunition was intact. He was pardoned. Onoda was not alone. Teruo Nakamura held out in Indonesia until 1974. Shoichi Yokoi survived on Guam until 1972. Others emerged in the 1950s and 60s. Some were never found. Each case followed the same pattern: isolation, rigid obedience, a refusal to accept a world that contradicted their orders. These men were not insane. They were consistent. They obeyed a system that had already abandoned them. For local populations, the war never ended cleanly. In the Philippines, civilians were shot decades after peace was declared. Homes were raided. Fields were burned. Lives were taken by soldiers officially belonging to a war long over. There were no tribunals for this violence, no formal accounting. Because how do you prosecute a war that, on paper, no longer exists? The Japanese government knew for years that holdouts existed. Search missions were limited. Negotiations were cautious. In some cases, non-existent. Publicly, these soldiers were inconvenient. They disrupted the narrative of recovery and responsibility. Privately, they represented something worse. Proof that wartime indoctrination had worked too well. To fully acknowledge them would require acknowledging what they were taught, and who taught them. These men are often described as loyal, dedicated, tragic. But loyalty without context is not virtue. It is a tool. The imperial system trained soldiers to replace judgment with obedience, to erase doubt, to accept death and inflict it without question. When the state collapsed, the conditioning remained. The empire was gone. The mindset was not. When these soldiers finally emerged, they were treated as relics, curiosities, symbols. Some were celebrated, some were pitied. Few were interrogated deeply. Their survival allowed the focus to shift from what the war did to others to what it did to them. Meanwhile, the victims of their post-war violence remained largely unnamed. History moved on again. These holdouts expose an uncomfortable truth. Wars do not end when documents are signed. They end when belief systems collapse. Sometimes that takes generations. Sometimes it never happens. Long after the bombs stopped falling, men were still pulling triggers, not because they hated, but because they obeyed. The real weapon of war was never the gun. It was the idea planted in the mind. When a state creates soldiers who can't stop fighting, does the war ever truly end?